Hi, this is Anton from the Terra team. In this video, we'll talk about creating assets for your datasets and creating snapshots from those assets. Before a snapshot can be created from a dataset, someone has to set which columns of the data can be accessed by different users. A dataset in the TDR can contain an enormous amount of data, including files and metadata, that will be circumstantially useful, or should only be accessible to certain users. This can include intermediary data used during sequencing processes, or protected data not intended for all eyes. Designating which columns are available to a given set of users is called creating an asset. An asset is a set of columns from a given dataset. If a dataset has no assets, this means that even if the dataset contains lots of data, none of those columns have been designated as shareable assets. No matter how much data there is, whether files or metadata, it won't be possible to create snapshots containing that data. An asset designates which columns from a dataset can be included in a snapshot and shared with others. Only after at least one asset has been created for a dataset will it be possible to create snapshots from that dataset. Once assets exist for a dataset, you'll be able to see a list of those assets in the TDR user interface by navigating to a given dataset, clicking the three-dashed triangle near the top right of the screen, and then clicking Create Snapshot. This will call up a view with an Assets drop-down that lists all of the available assets for that dataset. If a dataset has no assets, the Create Snapshot button will be grayed out. Asset creation is done via the Swagger API interface. There are two ways to create assets. The first way is to include the asset in the schema of your dataset when you're initially creating that dataset. The second way is to use the Add Dataset Asset Specifications API endpoint to add an asset to a dataset after that dataset has already been created. This will designate a set of columns from that dataset that can be included in a snapshot. Let's go through examples of both strategies. You can create the dataset with the asset already present by including the asset specification as part of your schema when you're creating the dataset. If you've already learned how to do this, then you know that the schema is a JSON object whose parameters define the contents of your dataset. The schema JSON object includes several nested JSON objects, set equal to JSON parameters such as tables that define the table contents of the dataset, and relationships that define the relations between the tables of the dataset. At minimum, your schema needs to include the tables parameter, which lists all of the tables of the dataset and all of the columns contained within each table. You can optionally include a relationships JSON object at the same level as the tables object, as well as an assets JSON object at the same level as well. Neither the relationships object nor the assets object are required when creating a dataset, and in the next part of this tutorial, we'll show you how to add assets after the fact. But it can be just as easy if you already know what assets you want to be a part of your dataset, which is to say, if you know which columns you want to share with which users. You can just include the assets parameter in the schema when you're initially creating the dataset. In this example, we have a schema JSON with a tables parameter set equal to a JSON object defining a single table named Table1. This table has 3 columns, labeled 1, 2, and 3, with some data types defined. On the same level as the tables object, we also have our assets object. The assets object includes 2 assets, asset 1 and asset 2. Both assets pull columns from table 1. Asset 1 pulls in column 1 and 2, whereas asset 2 pulls in columns 1 and 3. The assets object requires a single JSON object for each asset, containing the name for the asset, the table from which it's pulling data, and the names of the columns to be included in the asset. Don't forget that each asset needs to have a non-null value for the root table and root column parameter. There is also an optional follow parameter, in case your schema is also setting relationships, and you want your asset to follow those relationships. The follow parameter will look like this. The values correspond to the names of the relationships set in the relationships JSON object. If you execute the create dataset command with a JSON that contains assets, your dataset will automatically have those assets and you'll be able to see them in the TDR user interface. If you want to create assets after a dataset has already been created, instead you'll want to use the Add Dataset Asset Specification API endpoint, which you'll find in the Datasets section of the API page. Use this JSON code, shown here, as illustrated in the request body. The UUID for the dataset to which you wish to add this asset is specified here. You can see the request body simply contains a JSON object describing the asset exactly as it was shown in the previous example when including it in the initial schema. Executing this API will simply add this asset to the schema. Thank you for listening.